Have you ever wondered what's really going on in the mind of someone who pulled away from you, only to suddenly reappear? Not with a clear apology, not with emotional openness, but with a vague message, a subtle check-in. Just enough to stir hope, but not enough to offer closure. Hi, I'm Jim Rohn, and if you've ever found yourself questioning your worth after someone with avoidant tendencies disappeared, this video is going to bring you clarity. Because here's the truth. Avoidants do miss you, but the way they experience that missing is not what you might expect. For them, longing doesn't lead to reaching out. It leads to more withdrawal, more confusion, more inner chaos. What looks like silence on the outside is often a storm behind the scenes. A storm they rarely admit to and almost never explain. Seconds are wired to associate closeness with danger. Emotional intimacy can feel overwhelming even when it's with someone they genuinely care about. So when they begin to miss you, it doesn't pull them closer, it actually activates their defenses. They think pulling away will give them peace, but over time that silence becomes unbearable. It turns into tension, regret, restlessness, and eventually the very space they created to feel safe becomes the trigger that brings them back. In this video, we're going to explore that exact moment, when the avoidant starts to feel the absence they created, what they go through emotionally, why they don't always act on it directly, and how you, from a secure place, can choose peace over panic and clarity over chasing. If this speaks to something you've felt, I invite you to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because you deserve truth, not confusion, and love that shows up without fear. Let me tell you something most people misunderstand about avoidant individuals in relationships. Just because they aren't reaching out doesn't mean they've stopped caring. Just because they're quiet, distant, or have seemingly disappeared doesn't mean they've forgotten what you shared. With avoidance, the issue isn't absence of feeling, it's the suppression of it. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. When you're dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, what you're really seeing is someone who has learned to handle emotional overwhelm by shutting down. They're not heartless, they're not indifferent. In fact, many avoidants feel deeply, so deeply that their only way to survive it is to numb themselves. They compartmentalize, tucking their emotions into a locked box they pretend doesn't exist. But that box doesn't go away, it stays. What's inside isn't erased, it's buried. Avoidants don't disconnect because they've healed. They disconnect because connection feels threatening. They tell themselves stories like, "I didn't need them," or "It wasn't that serious," or "I'm fine." But beneath that narrative is emotional fear. Fear of what closeness might stir up. That's why it can feel so disorienting when someone you were once close to suddenly vanishes. One moment, they're emotionally engaged. The next, they've gone cold or disappeared entirely. And you're left wondering, how can they act like none of it mattered? Here's the truth. They're not acting like it didn't matter, they're acting out of habit. Their nervous system is doing what it was trained to do, push emotions down so they don't have to face the discomfort of vulnerability. Yes, they may seem composed, aloof, even unaffected, but inside, there's often a storm they refuse to acknowledge. Suppression works, for a while. But emotional energy does. What's buried begins to seep through in the quiet hours, the dreams, the random memories that rise up uninvited. That's when avoidants begin to feel haunted, not just by you, but by the version of themselves they had to abandon to avoid feeling you. The more you pull back, the more your absence creates a space they can't fill with distraction. You're no longer their emotional buffer. You're no longer present to absorb the emotional chaos they're unwilling to face. And that silence you left behind, it starts to echo. In that echo, they begin to feel everything they tried to bury: regret, longing, confusion, and sometimes, yes, even love. Avoidants don't avoid because they don't care. They avoid because caring costs them their emotional control. And they've built their identity around that control. But delayed pain is not avoided pain, it's postponed pain. and eventually it comes back. That's why you don't chase, you don't beg, you don't explain your worth to someone who's still trying to outrun their own emotional truth. Because the longer you stand in your self-respect, the more their system is left alone with everything they tried to bury, and eventually they remember not just the connection, but the version of themselves they once touched in your presence. The version they quietly miss, even if they can't name it yet. So no, your love didn't disappear. It didn't evaporate. It's just been sitting beneath the surface, waiting. But now that you've stepped away, that weight no longer belongs to you. It's theirs to face, their story to reckon with. And your peace? That's what you hold on to now. Emotional detachment isn't strength. It's not clarity, and it's certainly not healing. It's a learned defense, one that often gets mistaken for calmness, maturity, or control. But for many people, especially those with avoidant attachment styles, detachment isn't a conscious choice. It's something they developed early on as a way to survive emotional pain. They didn't decide to shut down out of malice or disinterest. They were trained, often without even realizing it, to associate closeness with danger, vulnerability with risk, love with the threat of loss. So when connection starts to feel too intimate, too emotionally demanding, or too exposed, they don't lean in, they retreat, not because they don't care, but because caring feels unsafe. What looks like coldness or indifference is often a nervous system going into self-protection mode. They pull back, go silent, over-rationalize. They may appear calm, even unbothered, but what you're witnessing is a shield, not a reflection of how little they feel, but how much they fear what they feel. And here's what most people miss: that emotional distance isn't about you. It's not an attack. It's a shield they've built to keep from feeling out of control. But that shield doesn't solve anything. It doesn't process pain. It doesn't repair connection. It only numbs things temporarily. And the more they rely on that distance to feel safe, the more they isolate themselves from the very things they long for: intimacy, trust, belonging, love. Over time, emotional detachment doesn't protect, it imprisons. It creates a deep internal conflict where they want closeness but feel overwhelmed by it. They want to love, but they're terrified of what that love might cost. So they enter a cycle: connect, retreat, suppress, regret. And if you've ever loved an avoidant, you've probably felt this firsthand. You get caught in the space between their silence and their longing. You start questioning your worth, misreading distance as disinterest, when in reality it's fear wrapped in a sophisticated disguise. And this is where your power comes in. Not in fixing them, not in pulling them back, but in remembering what's yours and what's not. Their emotional detachment is not about your value. It's about their wiring, their wounds, and no matter how deeply you love them, you cannot force them to stay emotionally present if their default is to run when it gets real. You can't heal someone's avoidance by offering more of yourself. That's not your job. That's not love. That's self-abandonment. True healing won't come from emotional distance. It comes from turning toward the discomfort, not away from it. And that kind of courage, it has to come from within them. Until then, your work is to stay grounded in reality. Don't chase someone who mistakes connection for danger. Don't measure your worth by someone else's capacity to stay. Know that just because someone has built walls around their heart doesn't mean you were meant to spend your life trying to tear them down. You deserve to be met, not managed. Loved, not feared. Chosen, not tolerated. Emotional detachment might feel like control to them, but to you it's important to recognize it for what it truly is: a temporary escape, not a foundation for lasting connection. And you deserve more than a connection that disappears the moment it deepens. The most self-honoring thing you can do? Step back. Let their silence speak. Let your boundaries hold. And trust that real love, secure love, won't feel like a test you have to pass or a puzzle you have to solve. It will feel like something You don't have to chase. There comes a moment, often later than you expect, when your absence speaks louder than your presence ever did. Especially with someone who leans avoidant, it might not seem that way at first. They may carry on as if nothing changed, calm, composed, silent. Life appears to move forward on their terms, untouched by your departure. And from the outside, it can feel like you were easily forgotten. But here's what most people don't see. Just because someone doesn't express what they feel, doesn't mean they don't feel it at all. Avoidants often suppress, not because they don't care, but because they never learned how to safely hold what they feel. When you were there, they may have taken your presence for granted. They may have felt smothered, overwhelmed, or confused by their own reactions to intimacy. So they pulled away, but the moment you're gone, something unexpected begins to unfold. The space they once craved now starts to echo with everything they tried to ignore. Your texts no longer light up their screen. Your voice no longer fills the quiet. The energy you brought, the calm, the challenge, the warmth, it's no longer part of their daily landscape. And that absence begins to shape itself. It takes a form. And that form is you, not the version they rationalized away, but the one their nervous system was silently registering all along. It's in the small details they didn't expect to notice. A song, a room, a routine that now feels, oddly, incomplete. Avoidants often believe that out of sight, out of mind will protect them. But emotional bonds don't vanish just because they've been boxed up. When someone has touched your life in a real way, even if you didn't let yourself fully feel it at the time, it lingers. And that lingering turns into tension. The very silence they once used as a shield becomes the mirror they can't look away from. This is the moment when avoidance begins to crack. When your absence stops being just a choice you made and starts becoming the consequence they feel. Not because you raised your voice, not because you demanded closure, but because you walked away with quiet conviction. You stopped chasing, stopped over-explaining, stopped softening your truth just to remain accessible. And that silence, that's the teacher, especially for someone who has spent their life running from emotional discomfort. Because when all distractions fade, when the background noise dies down, they're left with the questions they tried to outrun. Why did I push them away? What was I afraid of? And do I even know how to receive love that asks for nothing but presence? That's the power of your absence. Your presence could be ignored, but your silence, it gets felt. Not just intellectually, but viscerally, in the nervous system, in the body, in the stillness of those late-night hours where avoidance has nothing left to distract itself with. And this is where your secure self steps in, not to rescue, not to respond, but to recognize. You didn't need to convince anyone of your value. You just needed to remove your energy from where it was being misread. You didn't walk away to make a point. You walked away because you finally honored the one truth that matters most. You don't have to stay where you're only tolerated in fragments. You get to be whole. And sometimes it's not your presence that reminds someone of your worth, it's your absence. When your mind keeps circling back to someone who hurt you or left you without explanation, it's not because you're weak. It's not because you're overly emotional or holding on too tightly. It's because the brain is wired to seek resolution. That's not just psychology, it's biology. When we experience something emotionally intense, and we don't get closure or clarity, the brain doesn't simply file it away and move on. It holds on to it, it replays it, it searches for meaning in what feels unfinished, especially when that ending came in the form of mixed signals, silence, or emotional withdrawal rather than direct communication. Your mind becomes a detective trying to solve the mystery. You might find yourself revisiting conversations, analyzing their tone, their facial expressions, the last words they said. You wonder if you missed a cue, if you could have worded something differently, or if you somehow triggered the distance. But this isn't just overthinking. This is your brain's natural response to an unresolved emotional experience. It's trying to finish a story that has no ending. And unresolved emotions light up the threat system in the brain. Your nervous system senses something incomplete, unsafe, so it loops. This is particularly common when you've been involved with someone avoidant, because they often leave without explanation, pulling back, shutting down, disappearing emotionally or even physically. What you're left with isn't just the end of a relationship, it's the absence of emotional resolution. That lack of clarity creates a kind of mental hook. Your thoughts keep returning not because you want to suffer, but because your mind and body are both asking for closure, for understanding, for peace. And here's the twist. This happens for avoidant people too, but the way they process it looks very different. Instead of obsessing on the surface or reaching for answers, they bury the feelings, they disconnect. But buried isn't gone. Avoidants often think about past partners long after the relationship ends, not because they don't move on, but because the feelings they suppressed never got a chance to be processed. That's the truth. Fixation in both anxious and avoidant systems is not obsession. It's the mind's way of saying there's still something here that needs your attention. It's not a flaw, it's a signal. Your system isn't malfunctioning, it's trying to repair. The path forward isn't to shame yourself for still caring or force yourself to just move on. It's to gently acknowledge what remains unresolved, whether that's grief, rejection, abandonment, guilt, or a question of self-worth. Your freedom lies in facing it, not avoiding it. When you meet those feelings head-on without judgment, something powerful happens. The mind starts to let go. The nervous system begins to settle, not because everything is fixed, but because what was avoided is finally being witnessed. And that's what your system has been asking for all along. Not endless analysis, not desperate closure, but understanding. Unprocessed emotions are not weakness. They're unfinished work. And when we honor what still feels open, we stop spinning in confusion and start stepping into clarity. This isn't about going backward. It's about moving through with compassion, with truth, with your self-worth fully intact. You're not broken for remembering. You're healing because you're learning to stop running. And in that choice, to face instead of chase, you reclaim your peace. Time and distance don't erase value, they reveal it. That's something many people only come to understand after they've stepped back, let go, or been forced into separation. In the moment, especially when emotions are raw and rejection feels fresh, it's hard to see clearly. When someone pulls away, especially someone with avoidant tendencies, you may question your worth. You may assume their silence means you didn't matter, but that's not always true. For people with avoidant attachment styles, emotional closeness often feels overwhelming, even threatening. They struggle to process feelings in real time, so rather than lean in, they retreat. And when you're showing up with love, presence, consistency, they may not be able to meet it. Not because it isn't valuable, but because receiving it feels too vulnerable. Your emotional availability, your steadiness, your care, it might have felt like too much in the moment. They pull away, telling themselves that space will bring them back to center. But here's the twist. It's often that very space that finally brings clarity. When you're no longer there, when your voice is no longer part of their days, when your steady presence is no longer holding the emotional weight of the connection, they begin to feel it. Not in a dramatic burst, but in quiet, ordinary moments. A song, a routine, the absence of being truly seen. What once felt like pressure now echoes as comfort lost. Time softens the noise, space reveals the gaps. And in that stillness, your absence begins to speak louder than your presence ever could. Not because you were loud, but because you left with strength. You didn't beg, you didn't plead. You simply removed your energy, and in doing so allowed it to be felt for what it always was. This doesn't only happen with avoidance, it happens with anyone who's taken something or someone for granted. When you're too close to something, it's easy to overlook its impact. You assume it will always be there. But when it's gone, what it gave becomes undeniable. The grounding, the reflection, the emotional labor, the way someone made you feel without needing to explain it. Time and space don't lie. They peel away ego, noise, defensiveness. What's left is a deeper truth, often about what was lost. That's why leaving with dignity is so powerful. You don't have to force someone to recognize your value. You don't have to campaign for your worth. You simply give them the silence to sit with what's missing. And if they truly valued you, time won't dull that. It will sharpen it. Space won't fill the void. It will make the shape of it unmistakable. So no, you don't need to chase. You don't need to explain. You don't need to audition for love. You simply need to trust that what you brought was real, and when you walk away grounded in that truth, the absence you leave behind does the rest. The balance of power begins to shift the moment you stop trying to emotionally rescue someone. In relationships, especially those involving an avoidantly attached partner, there's often a silent, unconscious dynamic playing out. One person leans in, offering reassurance, holding emotional space, doing the work to keep things intact. The other leans out, maintaining distance, avoiding vulnerability, and protecting their emotional control through silence or withdrawal. When you're the one who keeps holding the emotional weight, it's easy to believe you're being strong, loving, or patient. You tell yourself that if you can just love them enough, explain yourself better, be more understanding, they'll eventually come closer. You start to manage their moods, silence your own needs, and excuse their emotional unavailability as something you can fix if you're just steady enough. But every time you do that, you unknowingly give away a little more of your power. Avoidants often rely on this pattern, not maliciously, but because it lets them avoid discomfort. As long as you're the one holding the connection together, they don't have to grow, they don't have to stretch, they don't have to sit in their own discomfort because someone else is doing it for them. But the moment you stop, everything shifts. When you stop initiating, stop explaining, stop trying to make things okay after they've pulled away, you hand their silence back to them. You stop managing their fear of intimacy and start honoring your boundaries instead. And in that stillness, something powerful happens. They're left to sit in the very space they created. The distance they asked for becomes theirs to navigate, and they have to face the emotional void you used to quietly fill. In that space, a choice emerges. They either step forward or they stay where they are and risk losing the connection. But this time, it's not on your shoulders to fix it. You've removed yourself from the role of the emotional manager. You've stopped protecting them from their own avoidance. You're no longer softening the consequences of their withdrawal. That's how your power returns. Not through confrontation, not through pleading, but through the refusal to keep playing a role that's costing you your peace. You reclaim your energy, your clarity, your self-respect, because relationships aren't meant to be one-sided emotional labor. Love isn't about saving someone from themselves. Real connection happens when both people meet in the middle, not when one person is constantly stretching, reaching, overgiving just to keep things afloat. When you step out of the emotional rescuer role, you're no longer over-partnering. You're allowing the relationship to either rise to meet you or collapse under its own imbalance. And either outcome is clarity. Because true strength isn't in holding everything together. It's in knowing when to stop trying to fix what was never yours to carry. You're not punishing anyone by stepping back. You're honoring yourself. And that's where real power lives. If you've made it this far, thank you for being here. Truly. It means you care deeply, not just about understanding others, but about understanding yourself. And that kind of self-awareness is powerful. Today, we explored what happens when you step out of the role of emotional rescuer, when you stop over-functioning, stop managing someone else's avoidance, and start honoring your own limits. We unpacked the subtle ways we can lose ourselves in trying to keep connection alive, and how the real shift begins the moment we choose to stand in our self-worth instead of chasing temporary closeness. Because love isn't proven by how much discomfort you're willing to endure. It's reflected in your ability to know when enough is enough. When you choose peace over performance. When you stop bending to be chosen and start standing in the truth that you're already enough, without over-explaining, without over-giving, without fixing what was never yours to fix. So wherever you are in your journey, know this: your clarity is power. Your boundaries are love. And walking away from patterns that hurt you is not a loss, it's a return to yourself. If this video spoke to something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Share your experience, your truth, your turning point. You never know who it might help. And if you found this valuable, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what's next. We're building something here, a space for emotional growth, grounded truth, and self-respect. You're not too much, you're not hard to love, you're just no longer available for dynamics that ask you to shrink. Keep choosing you every time.